And I'd like to just start really by focusing on the whole premise, actually, the title of the book. When my wonderful friend and colleague, the late Colin Ward, was once asked, what makes a good neighbourhood? He could have said, of course, as we would all say, fixing up the traffic, cheap, affordable housing, good housing, nice play spaces, safety, security, and so on. And instead, he recalled the response of someone. He said, a good neighbourhood is a wonderful place to grow up in. And I thought that was a wonderful starting point for me, because it was a really qualitative way that includes almost everything. A wonderful place to grow up in is a fun place, a productive place, a safe place, and the rest of it. And I use that really in my title, in the sense that The Placemaker's Guide to Building Community is about my bias, fixing up places, fixing up things, housing, improving place, but in a way that also builds the social and economic life of place, however you want to define it. There's a big discussion about what community is and so on that we can get onto. And I suppose I drive the book, as we start talking about it, with three assumptions that have been with me forever. But if one accepts them, I believe they fundamentally change not only the way in which we work, the process of work, in fact they turn things quite upside down, but also our professional roles, responsibilities, and relationships. Relationships to place, relationships to people. And again, I'll come back to that in a second. And the first assumption really is about, I suppose, the scope and purpose of practice. And it suggests that if we want to engage effectively with some of the global issues that are going on out there, and when I say we, I mean every one of us, it's no longer somebody else's problem. Issues of poverty, issues of climate change, issues of the loss of identity in cities as a result of globalization, enormous issues related to income inequity, social exclusion, the like, which, you know, in the past I would talk to my architectural students and they would say, yeah, but that's somebody else's problem. I design buildings. You know, it was a classic beginnings of saying, I'll get people out of the way so that I can produce good design, of course. If we want to engage with those big issues, which we all have to these days, yeah, then we have to fundamentally change the scope and purpose of practice. Not to give it up, not to become policymakers. What we have to do, essentially, is do our practical work, but in a way that adds strategic value to what we're talking about. Now, I'll come back to that issue a little later, because I deal with that in the book in part 4, I think it is. Come back to that. The second assumption is about the life and organization of place. Yeah? It's about the way in which, and I borrow a lovely comment from a little booklet that you sent me, it's about the way in which ordinary people overcome the limitations that they face in everyday life, and I'm talking mostly, of course, about the poorest sections of places in the world, which is where I work, in order to overcome the incredible limitations they face, both environmentally, politically, and otherwise, essentially hack into housing, services, utilities, and the rest. They transform them into things that can serve their purpose, and sometimes at great odds. Yeah? They improvise, they adapt, they use trial and error, the way things always work. They do that in order to find, in the first place, and then sustain a good fit between place and people. The question in my mind always is, to what extent does that process of improvisation, which Richard Sennett once called the user's art, that's what it is, we improvise, to what extent do we stamp that out in our design? God forbid that anybody should fiddle around with what I've produced as a building. And I say that when design and when planning becomes the sole domain of experts, all this street level and intelligent creativity of the informality of place gets lost. And what we get instead is an architecture of compliance where people are relegated at best to caretakers. You know, somebody else decides and you kind of look after it. And if you don't look after it, you're told off. The third assumption is about the nature of our own interventions as experts and about the way we work. And the lovely phrase that I like to use in the first place is that we've got to move off in that respect of the idea that we are, as experts, special kind of people, because we are, and adopt and accept also that every person out there is also a special kind of expert. Yeah? And unless you accept that, then you can't go into the kind of work that I do, which is to try and tap the incredible resourcefulness of place and mobilize it in the interests of improving it, as it were. Come back to that in a second. So the third assumption suggests that if you want to do a small change principle, if you want to do something big, and you want, if you want to do something big, you always start with something small, and you start with where it counts. Yeah. And that leads you to thinking not about big projects, but about catalysts. It leads you to thinking about getting things going rather than finishing things off. Tough for architects, tough for clients in a way. Not my kind of clients, but conventional clients. Catalysts to get things going. And from those catalysts to begin to work in ways that can reason backwards to more catalyst projects and bigger projects and so on. Again, I'll explain that in a second. And I always like to think, insofar as the urban work that I do, they're a bit like urban acupuncturists, you know, kind of trying to find that spot where I can just get that needle or touch something in to release enough energy so that places can fix themselves. Yeah. It's, from my point of view, that third assumption, a common sense assumption, and it's grounded in theories of action science and action planning, which I suppose has shaped certainly my work throughout from day one, from the days that I was building programs and projects here in London. These three assumptions about the nature of practice, about the life and organization of place, about the value of expert interventions, I explore in this little book, Placemaker's Guide, and I explore it in 4 ways and in each of the 4 parts of the book. In part 1, again very quickly I shall just review, part 1 is called Place, Time and Clutter, basically learning from practice, learning from precedents, looking at projects that have been great, projects that have been dreadful, and projects that have been absolutely ugly in some of the various townships and others that I visited throughout the world, but importantly learning lessons from them. And the question that I end up with, the chapters are organized in terms of description and lessons that I draw, and the question that I end up with in that first section is, why is it, given all the experience that we have, lessons that we know are not filtering through into practice? We'll come back to what some of those are. Lessons from the very basics of places that I visited, kitchens that people don't use because that's not the way they cook, concepts of public and private that are totally alien in certain cultures, the ways in which public space is impossible to socialize because it's not socially owned by anyone other than some higher authority somewhere else, etc., etc., etc. There's a whole list of stuff in that little first section of the book. The second part of the book in which I explore those 3 assumptions, which I call placemaking and the architecture of opportunity, is about practice. We land in place, and I go through the way I usually go about the business of making place, and I draw from examples all over the world and put them together as if they were in one place, because I think they tell much more when they're together. And I give examples, for example, of, in one particular situation, talking to a family, spotting out the back of my eye this rather droopy-faced buffalo that happened to be called Betty after the person that had donated this buffalo to the community. In fact, she donated this NGO 1 buffalo per 6 families. And we got talking about what that was and what their concept of neighborhood improvement was. And they were saying, well, we want enterprise, we want a center, we want education, we want training for kids, vocational subjects and all the rest of it. And then it emerged that this particular buffalo, 1 per 6 families, my first attempt in any place is try and find organization, because we want to work with community organizations. To say, well, why can't we actually turn these groups of 6 families into a planning committee to start with? And that's what we started to do, and we federated the 6 groups together, and so they formed a little planning committee. And we said, well, how can life be made better using the buffaloes? I said, well, actually, they built a community center up the road, and it's absolutely dreadful. Nobody uses it. You go into it, and I did. One room's called Theory Room, and this is, in Sri Lanka, it happens, it doesn't matter where it is. One room's called Theory Room, the other called Meeting Room. We don't meet in this kind of way. That's not how we do business and so on. And what we really want is a kind of an urban farm, as it were. And so that's what we did. And we actually created effectively an urban farm. The buffalo is a wonderful animal because its life is much longer than an ordinary cow. Its milk is much richer for children. With a bit of nurturing, it can do all sorts of other things. Not only that, its cream is sold off. So by bringing them together, creating a cooperative, we actually created a small industry in producing cream and milk. Those are put into pots, so we had a little potter going on at the same time, teaching kids in pottery making and so on. Those pots are covered and sold to tourists with little woven tapestry, lovely little woven things. Home-based industry, don't preempt that, but at least create a little shop at the urban farm. And so this actually grew. And you know what? Others looked at a series of urban farms which we started federating together. And we got really ambitious. So, well, if you federate these together, you can actually create an urban enterprise and not just a place-based enterprise. And who knows? We could even join the fair trade movement and become global. So from a single buffalo, a global agenda. I give examples in that part of the problem that most communities that I work in face, and that is how to get the kids to school because the buses can't go in, because the streets are too narrow, and we sit there talking half the time about how we can get the buses in, and you get people saying at the back, so no, why do we keep talking about the buses coming in? We need to talk about how to get the kids out. Oh, that's a good idea, which invokes a completely different set of. And in this particular occasion, in Small Change, I give the idea of the bicycle rickshaw. The pied bus, which is that the government hired bus drivers, except they didn't drive buses, they walked the kids to school. So they were safe, the mothers would not waste the 1.5 hours it would take every day away from work for which they would not get paid. And you know what? My agenda was not just to get the kids to school, that was the practical bit. The strategic bit was to mobilize children as part of the planning process. Yeah? And so one driver per about 10, 12 children, he would collect them, little groups that would actually do transect walks to school. They would change the route every occasionally. So they'd actually cross barriers that were in conflict, ethnic barriers, income barriers, that they would say, oh, we don't like to walk over there. Well, we walk over there. And they meet people and talk. So they actually started creating boundaries, as it were, crossing boundaries between. And getting to school and actually talking about the importance, being told off because their uniforms were muddy. I see, what does that mean? Well, maybe that means we need to pave the streets in some of the areas because they've flooded, literally. And so on and so on. The kids elected then one member from each of the groups to talk together in terms of planning needs. They then elected one further member to sit on the community planning committee. So we actually had managed to integrate the children working from a very practical solution, which is how to get the kids to school. Lots of examples, all about improving place. Just one further one done by one of my students at the DPU, in fact, borrowed from him. It happened to be an area close to a market. The market traders wanted a stall to wheel to the market. They sometimes spent the night. And so we thought, well, why not actually make a frame that could be cladded in all sorts of different materials, everything from cardboard to sophisticated stuff. The actual frame could be made out of recycled materials. We went back to the farm and set up an enterprise to actually put these things together. They were actually making flat packs that they could sell to the government. It would tidy up the market, because that's what the government was saying. We don't want to displace it, but it needs to be regulated in some way. We turned the unit, it was a mobile unit, could be actually dragged to market. The top folds up, it's illustrated in the book. The guy could sleep for the night there, as it were, in the marketplace. We then used it as a toolbox that could go around and train people on how to use ordinary materials to fix up their houses, and so on, and so on, and so on. Part 2 tells the story of how, as it were, to operate in practice. Part 3, I should say that importantly, from part 2, I end up that chapter with just drawing some important principles, and I'll just read you one or two of them. Reasoning backwards from buffaloes, happen to be mushrooms, getting to school, to enterprise and organization, from enterprise to community building, from community building to partnerships, to good governance and sustainable livelihoods, to meeting the Millennium Development Goals, up, 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 back to mushrooms, back to buffaloes, and the rest of it. Cycle going that way. Building local organizations wherever possible for enterprise, for planning, for management, for savings. Encouraging networks, connecting as many of the initiatives as possible together, adding social and economic value, however seemingly unlikely it may be. That's where the real entrepreneurship is, as it were, and so on. So there's about a dozen or so principles that I end up that chapter with. The third way in which I explore those three assumptions is in a part that I call responsible practice and the question of scale. The big critique that I always get from my community action planning projects, great little projects, but so what? Anyone can do little projects. How can you scale them up so that they become urban, national, even regional in impact? And so the question really is, how do we scale things up? And here in that chapter, responsible practice and the question of scale, I deal with two things. First thing that I deal with is our own set of professional expert responsibilities, which I mentioned right at the beginning had to change. And the second, those components of getting strategic, which I'll come back to. I have my PEAS principle, and it's not a green agenda either, but it could be. PEAS. When I wrote my housing book some time ago, a book I wrote called Housing Without Houses, for all sorts of reasons, I argued in that book that we've got to move away from being providers to being enablers. And to use a little bit of the politics given the occasion, I've since decided that to be a good enabler, you actually have to be a prudent provider. There's always stuff we provide. It may be training, it may be materials, it may be skills, it may be buildings, whatever it is. But there's a difference between providing in its own right versus providing in order to, for the E in P's, to enable people to provide for themselves. Totally different agenda. And I argue that if providing remains a discrete element on its own, then two things, one or other of two things happen. Either it becomes prescriptive, top-down, which is what we know, leave it to me. It turns perfectly capable people into beggars. Everybody's waiting around for stuff to be delivered. Yeah? Or it becomes charity. Neither of those two, we've learned, are sustainable. I have nothing against charity in the early stages of disasters, but not as a development initiative, in the same way as this buffalo was gifted to this family that I was talking to. So, and I, as is often said, charity makes us feel really good about ourselves, but the question really is, what does it actually do in the longer term? So providing on its own is either prescriptive, becomes top-down, or as I say, it becomes charity. People become dependent on having everything provided. Creativity and perfection become the mandate of the elite and the gifted. That's what we do. That's my business. I'm the gifted. I'm the elite, as it were. Yeah? The expert, as I was saying, comes to be seen as a special kind of person, rather than every person a special kind of expert. Enabling, the E of P's is the enabling. And again, when we think about our roles as enablers, there are three areas to think about, and I borrow from my colleague in those three areas. One, enablement as in community enablement. Yeah, that's building the capacity, cultivating choice, enabling community to participate effectively. It invokes all sorts of differences in power relations. It can get quite political, quite messy. Community enablement. Political enablement, which is of course where everybody says, yeah, but that's not my business. And I can give you examples where myself and Stuart got absolutely wrapped up in all sorts of political debates with the Foreign Office and negotiating debt exchange agreements with the government of Ecuador, for example. And I say, well, is it my business? Do I know anything about this? No, I know nothing about this, but what the hell, right? Political enablement, influencing policy, changing standards, opening doors, resolving discrimination, dealing with all the stuff that actually gets in the way of anything this stuff happening. The discrimination that I talk about, of course, is discrimination that's very often built into our planning laws, into our standards, to the way in which we finance projects and so on. And the third is market enablement, the inevitable one, which is new partnerships, often referred to in the good governance debate between the state, the market, and of course civil society. How do we bring the market in, but in a way that is productive in relationship to civil society? The third part of P's is the A, which is the inevitability that the environment changes, adapts, grows. Why is it that I just find half my time in teaching and in education and design studios that we are taught to finish it, congeal it, deliver it, right? I feel privileged most of the development programs that I get involved in that I'm actually invited to join a process that's ongoing. Yeah? So adaptability is the inevitable part of any environment. And what I say is that in order to change, to fit, because good fit demands that we adapt, we change, right? Then we have to also make places fit for change. Right? So change becomes an integral part of our design and planning agenda, rather than something that happens, it'll happen by chance anyway, but as it were, prevented. And again, I refer to Colin Ward, who had three, I think, important things to think about adaptability. One was the incredible variability of the vernacular. Let's just look at what people do in any case. Yeah. The second is the concept of conviviality, as in Ivan Illich's days, which is the ability of people to stamp their identity on place, convivial in that sense. And the third is dear old Simon Nicholson's theory of loose parts, where he said that in any environment, both the degree of inventiveness and creativity and the possibilities for discovery are directly proportional to the number and kind of variables in it. How do we open up choice in the way in which we plan rather than close choices off because we've got to deliver on projects? Fundamentally different relationship to programs and project making. Yeah? So how do we invite change? Yeah? Who are and what are the agents of change? How can we enable it rather than disable it? And the third part of PAS is that wonderful S word, sustainability. How can we keep it all going? I love to collect shop signs when I travel around these places and so on. They tell a lot about place. You know, head shine and shoe shine. We work at both ends. What a wonderful title. Why not? Have your shoes cleaned whilst you're having your haircut. Gloria's Head for Heights. Oh, lovely thing. Somebody in Cornwall gave me a lovely one the other day. He said, was it the animal-friendly butcher's shop? Anyway, the one that caught my attention mostly was the sustainable barber shop, and we had to just go in and talk to this guy. And I half thought that we were going to go in and find these solar-powered electric razors. He was recycling grey water, and who knows, a copy of the brand report sitting on his desk, going through that sort of thing. But of course, there was none of that. He turned to the guy and said, "What on earth is a sustainable barber shop?" And he said, "Well," he thought for a bit. He said, "When my customers come in, I cut their hair just enough so that they're satisfied, but not too much so they come back sooner rather than later." What other definition do you need than that for sustainability? And so by the time we provided to enable, by the time people have enabled providing for themselves, by the time we've reviewed what we provided and how we've enabled so that the environment can be adapted, you already have a definition of sustainability. The second, very quickly, part of that, going to scale, as I mentioned to you, was those key components of making practice strategic. And I have 6, and I don't have time to go, lots of time to read the book. Yeah, good. And the first, clearly, is about inducing change. I mean, I don't want to get into the being election day and that word being bandied about. Importantly, change in our own professional conduct. I've discovered that one of the biggest barriers to us not achieving that strategic agenda is the way in which we perceive ourselves as experts. And I'm talking largely about experts, about architects, planners, engineers, built environment specialists here. Certainly change in practice procedure, actually reversing the old Geddes routine of survey, analyze, plan, implement, reversing it the other way around, do something first, think about it for a bit, reflect on it a bit, do a bit more, see where it goes, all right? Absolutely reversing it the other way around. The change that we induce when we intervene, and I always say that wherever we are, however we do it, we always disturb the current circumstances. When I arrive, wherever, before I've even started, my very face and presence disturbs. Sometimes we're invited to disturb, sometimes we disturb by virtue of a global agenda that demands we disturb place, etc. It's a very kind of touchy issue about our own intervention in that sense. But the change we induce inevitably in perception and impact when we intervene. And thirdly, the change that's integral to design and planning, as I was saying. The second strategic component is the recognition that we have to increasingly deal not just with the symptoms of problems, but with the primary causes of problems. Yeah? You know, if you've got bad housing there, it's one thing to go and fix up the house, that's the practical agenda. But what is the primary cause behind that bad housing, right? And you immediately get into insecurity, lack of money, social exclusion, polarization of communities all in one place, and immediately you go, but that's somebody else's work. Yeah, I'll fix up the house. Right? And I go back to that very first assumption that we've got to integrate the strategic agenda into our practical work. And there are 6 generic ones across all these sectors of housing, health, and so on that I've come across that always recur that are primary causes. And the first is about ownership. And it's not just ownership of solutions, it's ownership of the problem. I don't know how many times I've gone into a place working, for example, with UNICEF, and they go, right, this program is about immunization. And you talk to the community and say, well, we don't need immunization. We've been living like this for I don't know how long. We need to fix up our houses, or we need food security. All right? And they go, yeah, well, we don't actually do housing, says UNICEF. We do immunization. All right. They don't own the problem that UNICEF had defined for them, although there may be a problem there. So ownership of solutions and problems. Reducing dependency thinking. And as my colleague in Sri Lanka once said, particularly in post-tsunami, these incredibly capable people who can build their houses out of all that rubbish that we saw on the beaches hanging around. When I talked to them, so why don't you build your own houses? So no, if we build our own houses, we won't get one of those over there. They're handing out these nice concrete ones that you can't adjust, the kitchens you can't use, with gas cylinders you can't afford to buy, etc., etc. Right? And so my colleague that I was working with said it turns perfectly capable people into beggars. That's what it does. We've got to somehow reduce that dependency thinking. Misdirected priorities, similar sort of issue. The lack of organizational capacity, and the whole issue of poverty and vulnerability, the reduction of vulnerability. The way in which we can build houses, put in water, whatever, in order to build up the only safeguard we all have from the shocks and stresses of daily life, which is those assets that we contain. And I'm not just talking about financial and physical assets here, but social assets, political assets, human resource assets, and the rest. That's part of the sustainable livelihood model, and again, more in the book about that. So that's the third agenda, reducing vulnerability. The fourth primary cause, the fourth strategic component of planning is managing constraints. Constraints of two kinds. There are constraints to accessing resources for people to satisfy their own needs, yeah? And they're usually constraints as a result of discrimination. Discrimination according to gender, age, income, ethnicity, and again, some of those built into our laws. And then, of course, there are program constraints. Always financial, institutional, political, environmental constraints to actually getting the program underway. I always like to think that some constraints, and here's where it gets difficult, inevitably, like it or not, are a context for our work to be worked towards in the longer term, and others, of course, are constraints that disable what we wanted in the first place. Right? It's no use somebody coming along, as I have, saying to me, we've got a fantastic proposal to do this. Actually, this is not the right day to be saying this. But the government's got to change. And you go, government's going to change? How can I don't know when that's going to happen. Well, there's nothing we can do until it changes. You know? That's complete nonsense. It's not a good proposal if that's what it's about. All right, so managing constraints. Fifth, getting strategic is going to scale specifically, scaling up ideas, scaling up insofar as impacts, scaling up our technologies, whatever it may be. And again, I deal with scaling up in four ways: scaling up quantitatively, functionally, politically, and organizationally. And each have certain routines to them that we need to engage in getting our programs scaled up. And the final strategic agenda is learning. We don't reflect enough on what we've done, and when we do, and even if we do learn, we don't integrate that learning back into practice, partly because it threatens our professional expertise, partly because it means I will have to change, and it changes the status quo. Why should I do that? All right? I'm comfortable enough as it is, etc., etc. The learning agenda de facto engages us with strategic work and change. Part 4 is all about teaching. How do I bring all of this stuff and those assumptions that I started with into the classroom? And how do we do it in ways which are engaging and which are fun? And I describe in my book a studio that I've been running, a design studio, partly at Brooks, more recently for a number of years at the Development Planning Unit at University College London. I ran it, I was terrified running it at the Rhode Island School of Design over in Providence, USA. Not for architects, anyone that I was used to running it with, but industrial designers and graphic designers. What have they got to do with all this? It's a fantastic studio, right? And the question really is, for me in teaching, is how do you bring all of this stuff into the studio without oversimplifying it? How do you do it in a way that encourages the discomfort, the uncertainty that we all face when we're out there? How do we do it in a way that questions the concept of client? You know, this wonderful, tidy way in which all our clients in studio are wonderfully defined. They're on your side, they speak your language, they've got the site, they've got the money. You go out there, I can't even find the client. And somebody says, no, but yours is a community client. What is a community client? Etc. So how do we bring all this stuff into the studio in the complex way, recognizing that we have the privilege of, as it were, reflecting on all this stuff in the calm, as it were, before we confront the mess of practice out there. And so I describe and illustrate with examples and so on. And then finally, I end up with a number of reflections from my own work and ask everyone to devise and develop their own code of conduct as professionals. And I start that by listing 4 or 5 principles, codes that have been very important for me in all of this. And the first, more by summary really, in order to plan forwards effectively, efficiently and equitably, it's much better to reason backwards as it were, from what you see on the ground up towards policy. And my diagrams illustrate how we begin to bring policy and practice together in that way. Secondly, scaling up impacts in ways which are sustainable and accountable. If you're going to scale up, you have to at the same time scale down the units of organization. Great examples out there of women's banks and so on who are federated in Sri Lanka, for example, and they're turning $7.5 million worth of accounts. The units of organization are 15 women saving on a street. How do we use that as an organizational model in our planning? Yeah. So scale. You want to scale up, scale down organizationally. Thirdly, as we continue to construct our projects and programs, as we must, we have to deconstruct the processes that are implicit in them. And that's not just so that we can, as it were, be fancy about the processes, but it is a fundamental to participatory planning, is that unless your process is transparent, you can't have people participating in the real way in which decisions are made. You do what you do in ways that you do it, and then you get people tinkering around with the product. It's very tough criticizing one's own work. The two projects that I did in London with the Greater London Council, where we built these shells and we worked very closely with families to design their own houses. At the end of the day, the process was decided, and most people just tinkered around with a few panels to figure out where they wanted a dining kitchen or a couple of bedrooms and so on. We were trying to make progress, but all right. So, construct programs, we've constantly got to deconstruct these complementarity of these opposites all the time, as it were. Fourth, we need both order, the order of habit, the order of routine, the order of rules and rituals which give us our kind of continuity and our common purpose, as it were. Many of them are implicit in our cultural norms, they're implicit in our legal systems and the rest of it. But we also need, inevitably, the disorder of progress. Random, incremental sometimes, and we know it in practice, the mess of practice, where we stumble into ideas and opportunities, we take those opportunities and turn them into something productive, and the rest. The order of place and the disorder of progress are complementary routines. And what we constantly try and do, I find, is that we actually try and, as it were, get rid of the disorder so that we can produce these great plans. And in that sense, again, deny the progressive way in which places adapt to fit. And finally, the fifth, no, there are six, sorry. The need for divergence in order to explore differences, to find new avenues for our work, and at the same time, the need for convergence, because we need to reach consensus to move forward with our public. Again, those two worlds have to be, as it were, together. And the sixth, my colleague at MIT, Don Schoen, wrote a lovely book called The Reflective Practitioner, in which he talked about the choices that we have to make in terms of our careers. We could either be rigorous to our discipline in ways which are hopelessly irrelevant very often to outside, or we have to be relevant but in ways that are often hopelessly unrigorous. And I used to agree with him fundamentally, and I actually now no longer entirely agree with him, because I believe the question really is, how can you be rigorous in a way that's relevant? And in my book I compare these things. Being rigorous means about being reductive, to reduce complex systems into well-tried routines. Outside, to be relevant, you have to be expansive, open up opportunities. You look at our education. I was taught you start with a whole bundle of variables, you whittle them down, you deliver the project. Right? Outside, most of the time, you start with whatever it is, and you expand the variables in the hope that you're expanding the choice so that some of them will fit, as it were, what's going on out there. To be rigorous is to be certain, to be consistent, to be precise. To be relevant is to be uncertain, to, in many ways, encourage ambiguity, dance with randomness, as someone once called it, and the rest of it. Very uncomfortable professional things to be doing. To be rigorous is to be generic, prototypical, best practices, and so on. To be relevant is very often about being particular, about being contextual, and the rest of it. Rigorous, knowing, data, all that. Being relevant, Eric Dudley once called being relevant is reaching that state of optimal ignorance. The reflective practitioner, I always think, is a bit like Plato's philosopher, someone who stands somewhere between knowing and not knowing. And that's usually where I find myself most of the time. Finally, I give everyone a chance, and I start them off, develop your own kind of code of conduct. And I call whoever it is the development practitioner, because we're all interested in development here. And I start the list off by saying the development practitioner knows, needs, works for, believes, hopes, delivers, respects, takes, gives. Carry on. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabeel. It was wide-ranging and thoughtful, and I'm particularly grateful for the buffalo as a unit of social organisation. One buffalo, 6 people, is that right?
Yep. 6 buffaloes, many more.
I'm sure you have some questions for Nabeel, but while you're framing them, I've had a chance to look at his book, so there's a couple of things that I'm curious about. There are examples scattered throughout of what you at one point call this the informal sector, this idea that people should be let to build what they can for themselves, and the technicians, the professionals, build the stuff that people can't do for themselves. And there are examples in the book, and we have today the Aravena's marvelous half-housing example in Chile. This is a housing project in Chile that the architect Alejandro Aravena designed. He designed half-houses, and the local authority built half-houses, and tenants qualified on the basis that they would finish the houses off. So it's responded to their natural habits of adaptation, extension, and so on. Here's my question: am I simply unimaginative, or why is this so hard to imagine in the UK, in the area of the built environment?
Tough day, this. Well, it's often said, and I don't know, I mean, as you know, most of my work in recent years has been outside of this country. I find it absolutely fascinating. This is probably one of the most regulated countries anywhere. In one sense, the most wonderful way, through the welfare system and the rest, but in another sense, in the most dependency-inducing way. And one of my anthropological colleagues once said that it may well be time to start dismantling bits of legislation without actually putting anything else in their place. I thought that was quite a nice way of putting it. But I also think, we're there's history, planning was invented here, as it were, in many ways, and exported elsewhere. So I think it's a legacy in that sense. But I also think that there isn't the responsibility. To take responsibility has to be rebuilt up again, and you don't take responsibility if you don't think you're going to have an impact. And when we talk about participation as a key part of our urban planning and so on, it's still talked about, it's consultation really, that ladder of citizen participation, where I'll decide and I'll do what I do, and I'll pin it up in the town hall, you can come and have a look at it and make a comment. And that's the level we're at. Occasionally, if you're lucky, it's a sign in the street if it doesn't get blown down or graffitied out or whatever it is. So I do think it's part of, it's inbred into the system. But we're doing some work with an NGO called Multi-Story at the moment in Birmingham, from a kind of small change point of view. And it's really interesting to see how, with a slightly different perception, this is really about involving including artists in urban regeneration, how if you go around and look slightly differently at what's going on, you can find the buffalo, right? We bumped into a guy, somebody gave me an example, it was absolutely fantastic. Guy who hires skips out, lives on a place at the back alley. The back alley is filthy. Everyone piles rubbish into the back alley, and he was absolutely pissed off with it. Language. And so he thought what he would do is he would put a skip in the back alley and see what happened. And he did, and the alleys were completely clean. Everyone used the skip to put the rubbish in. And the concept of that was, well, maybe we could have actually a community contract in waste management that uses local people, maybe on the site and so on. And we start working with that. Start working with things that you actually see happening on the ground. And it's amazing how you can start building up an entire agenda. Now, the trouble with the process here is that it's difficult to control. And we know that planning, what is planning? Planning is about control at the end of the day. Planning is about compliance. Planning is about eliminating, as far as you can, the discretion that people have to adapt and make things as they want. It's built into our system. And I can tell that lovely story about the Oxford buses. I must tell it.
Yes, you must.
No, I always say when compliance takes precedent over discretion, right? Systems become self-serving. And the Confederation of British Industries did a little survey a little while ago with bus drivers, because the public complain that buses don't seem to stop at bus stops. And you go, and it's still now in Oxford, you have to wave down, if there's a bus, you have to get back. The resounding conclusion that came from the bus drivers was, how can you stick to timetables if you have to keep stopping for passengers? And you go, what the hell's going on here? What on earth is happening? Systems become self-serving.